Here we go. All right. Hi, David, Norman, and Rune. Thank you so much for joining me here today on my website, Vonvo.com. It's a pleasure to have both of you, all three of you, I should say. I just wanted to go over a few quick items before we begin. So my name's Max Ringelheim. I'm the co-founder of Vonvo.com. Once again, thank you for joining me here for a discussion on Israel and Palestine. It's Sunday, December 30th. I'm just informing you now that this video is being recorded, and once the discussion is over, we will be uploading the video to the internet and posting it to our Vonvo YouTube channel. Is that fine with all three of you?
It's fine.
Sure.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, great. And last item that I just want to bring up, I just want to set forth a few rules and regulations regarding Vonvo. We don't want there to be any personal attacks, no insults or racist remarks, or any belittling. And we just want to keep the conversation civil and valuable. Can we all agree to those, real short rules? Great. Okay. Thanks so much. All right, great. So let's get the discussion started then regarding Israel and Palestine. First, just to ease our way into it, David, Norman, and Rune. We'll start with David. Can you just quick, for any of our viewers and people who watch this discussion on YouTube a week from now, a month from now, can you just give any of our viewers a quick background on yourself, a quick bio?
Okay, I live in Rehovot in Israel. That's a small city, more or less between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. I'm a blogger, and the blog's called 5 Minutes for Israel. I try to work as a volunteer in Hasbara as much as I can.
Okay.
Any particular direction you want the explanation?
No. I mean that should work. Norman, how about yourself?
Well, I'm originally from South Africa. I came to the United States, where I now live and am retired. And I'm particularly interested in both this conflict and what goes on in South Africa, obviously.
Great. And Rune, how about yourself?
I've been an activist in the West Bank on several occasions. I would, in terms of my position in the conflict, I would say I think it's important not to be polarized. It's not. It's a bit when you refer to South Africa. It's not a matter of we weren't against apartheid because we were anti-white or pro-black. It's a matter of justice, and I think that's my angle on the conflict, also based on my experience.
Okay, and quickly, Rune, where were you from? I just didn't catch that.
From Denmark.
Oh yeah, you told me that before. Okay, great. All right, so why don't we start with another simple question to ease our way into it? Each of you can address this. How did you each become so passionate about this subject and this topic? Norman, do you want to go first?
Well, I'm not sure I'm passionate about it. My background is I'm a major in mathematics and statistics, so I guess I have a logical turn of mind. I'm interested in chess. I'm interested in my roots. I regard myself as an earthling. So I'd like to see a solution because I have friends and relatives in Israel. I have a friend here in the United States who's Palestinian, and he tells me he and I wouldn't be able to live over there. So I'm not sure I believe that, but in any event, that's essentially my
Okay.
An intractable challenge that some solutions.
Okay, great.
That's it.
And David, how about yourself? How did you get so passionate about this subject?
I've been involved with this sort of thing since I suppose my late teens. I was born in Australia. I was a minor student leader in Australia in the struggle against the PLO, and came to live in Israel. And I consider my country to be at war, and I'm fighting this war with the tools that I have.
Right. And Rune, you can go ahead as well.
It's a good question. I think it's because when you grow up in the West, in Europe as I did, you experience this dichotomy between the way the media talk about this conflict and the way that people around you who know a little bit about it talk about it. So it's basically a struggle over what is real, and is it can it really be so complex? And for me, the inspiration to go to Palestine came from watching Norman Finkelstein, who swept the floor with a Danish, very right-wing Danish journalist on Danish television. So that's where I sort of got into it in a slightly more serious manner, I guess you could say.
Great. Okay, so there's a few topics that I want to try and cover. Last weekend we dug into this subject of whether or not the labeling of Israel as an apartheid state is a justified title. I think I want to dig a little bit into that idea, and there are a few other smaller items that we can talk about. But let's get the discussion going on that. Rune, do you consider that labeling of Israel as an apartheid state to be accurate?
Yes, absolutely, I do. Of course, as soon as you ask the question, you have to make a distinction between what goes on in the West Bank and what's on in what you call Green Line Israel. I think it'd be very hard to make the case that life in the West Bank isn't. The West Bank is functioning as an apartheid state. You have literally two different legal systems, one of which is very oppressive for two different populations. So that case is very easy to make. Of course, it gets more complex when you're looking at Green Line Israel. But the fact is that there are two kinds of citizenship within Green Line Israel, and they carry, in effect, very different privileges and possibilities.
Right.
So yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay, David, can you support that claim, or do you have a little bit different take on it?
Sure I have. But I'm curious if I can ask Rune a question. What other countries of the 192 countries in the world do you also consider to be an apartheid state?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a list of countries that I would consider apartheid states.
Because I'm going to give you countries that I consider to be much more of an apartheid state than Israel, because I think that it's amazing how the Israel haters have captured the language. Apartheid now is only, it seems, used against Israel. But let's compare, say, Israel with Lebanon. I use Lebanon because Lebanon has a Palestinian community. And in Israel, the Arabs have the vote. In Lebanon, after 63 years in Lebanon, they're not allowed to be citizens. In Israel, the Arabs go to every university, every school. They make up about 20% of the population in universities, which is about their percentage of the population. In Lebanon, they're not allowed to go to higher education. In Israel, they work in every profession. I don't know of any profession where they are not allowed to work. In Lebanon, there is a whole long list of professions that are excluded the Palestinians. In Israel, they largely live where they want to live. In Lebanon, unless you're rich enough to bribe your way out, you are forced to live in a camp. I can go on with many more examples, but why aren't you calling Lebanon an apartheid state?
I'm sure if we were discussing Lebanon, I would have much to say about the reality in Lebanon. There is a historic process that we have to look at, though. We're talking about the indigenous population in the country, the people who originally lived there. We're talking about their rights in a given country.
Wait a second. Who are the indigenous people in South Africa?
Yeah.
Norman,
who are the indigenous people in South Africa?
Maybe let's
Is that the
People in South Africa. Yes.
Go ahead, Rune.
Okay. The original Africans who didn't immigrate from Europe would be the indigenous people in South Africa.
Norman, would you like to correct him on that?
Well, okay. Just refresh my thinking here. What is the sentence you want me to verify?
We were talking about what does it mean to be indigenous, and the point I was going to make, rather than going around in circles, is that the Africans in South Africa were invaders who came from the north more or less at the same time as the Europeans came from the south. The actual indigenous people of South Africa are the Bushmen, who are persecuted, I don't want to use that word, I've not been to South Africa. Shall we say, are discriminated against minority in South Africa? This is very important because if we want to go in that direction, the Palestinians are not indigenous to Palestine either. But I don't think it's not that relevant to me because, sorry, you wanted to say something, Max?
Yeah, no, let's let Norman come in here.
Well, I beg your pardon?
Go ahead, Norman.
You want me to come in and
yes.
check that? I'm not sure that down this particular road that we'll achieve anything by it. I would never have thought of Israel unless it had been brought up this way as an apartheid state. Having said that, there are too many other variables involved that make South Africa pre-apartheid, pre-ANC, if you will, pre-94, when apartheid was in existence. There are too many aspects of it that are so very different from the Israeli-Palestinian situation. My personal thoughts are that, like Kenning, I regard myself as an earthling. I wish there were no borders between different parts of the world. Just to be clear, I wish there was no religion on this planet. I wish we all lived in the 21st century. So for what my thinking is. Like I say, I see some elements in the West Bank that sort of remind me of what it might have been in an apartheid situation. But I think that's a too simplistic a definition of what Israel and the Palestinians and their relationship is to describe it as an apartheid state. So I don't think it's a fair description. At the same time, the thing in the West Bank, the settlers being in the bank, that is very troubling to me. I don't see the end game in that. So, but just talking about the apartheid situation, very, very different. A very different scenario in South Africa, and apartheid there was defined rulers, particularly the segment that was Dutch or Afrikaans, they they created the connotation of apartheid. It wasn't thrust on them, so they were kind of proud of it, and they thought apartheid was separate but equal. And I think that the West Bank, or the Palestinians particularly, are separate. They may be separate, but they're certainly not equal. And there's no goal that I can see that Israel wants to have them as equal. And then, you would have to talk about the Muslims or Arabs or non-Jews in Israel. Are they subject to any form of apartheid? They are subject to differences from the regular citizenship, and I'm not sure why that is.
Right.
So I have a suspicion that when you're surrounded by folks that consider you an enemy and need to be warred against, I can see that you'd have some sensitivity and there'd be some tension in your life that would cause you to react,
Right.
unhappily.
Yeah. So, Rune or David, do you have any comments off of what Norman has to say here?
I think one thing is the idea of separate but equal is always the discourse that is used when you practice some form of what you would call apartheid in the American South. The whites used to use the same argument. They said we have two different cultures down here that are apart, and in fact it wasn't two different but equal cultures. It was one culture oppressing the other, marginalizing the other. That's also what took place in South Africa. And it's certainly what takes place in the West Bank. And to some extent, it's also what takes place within Greenland and Israel, if you look at housing possibilities, for instance.
Well,
Go ahead.
Okay. I think the answer to that was what Norman said. Israel and South Africa, we have to compare the two because apartheid is a South African invention. But no Israeli that I've ever heard has used the term separate but equal. Israelis say, and I can provide dozens of examples, that they are under attack and they have to protect themselves. Now, are you looking at countries that are at war, which I believe Israel is and has been for the last 63 years, or are you looking at countries that are discriminating against their own citizens? Let me remind you that the Palestinians, it's interesting you say the West Bank, but you don't mention Gaza. But are the Palestinians Israeli citizens? No, they refuse to be Israeli citizens. Are they attacking Israel? Yes, frequently. So if we would compare it with any other country, what does Israel do that any other country in the same situation hasn't done? And worse.
So
you can't compare it to the other country because any other country doesn't. Because any other country doesn't besiege its neighbors, it doesn't steal their water resources, it doesn't put checkpoints up all over, it doesn't make it encourage the neighbors to have an economy.
This brings up something that I wanted to bring up.
Right, so guys, just quickly, let me interject here. For the video purposes, our technology unfortunately isn't perfect. So, like, when we're speaking, I'm sure you guys are fine with this. Just we'll go one at a time. I'm fine with you guys taking the conversation where you want, but just one at a time would be best for the quality of the video. So, David, why don't you address what Rune, I think, just finished his point, right, Rune?
Okay. Right. Israel is not... I wanted to mention this at the beginning, but it does make the point. This is written as Israeli and Palestinian conflict. It isn't. It is Israel, Palestine, its Arab neighbours, and the Muslim world conflict. The idea that Israel is besieging the Palestinian has to be balanced by the fact that until Egypt and Jordan had a treaty with Israel, every Arab country was at war with Israel. Even now, Israel is formally at war with most Arab countries. Now, if you talk about besieging, there has been a boycott and siege, if you like, against Israel for 63 years.
That was the point that Israel has been under siege in the last 63 years. That's your serious. That's your claim. Because as far as
I believe I can justify it. What do you do? Do you not think that Israel has been at war for 63 years? Do you not think that people come across the border and blow up buses and schools and restaurants in Israel? Do you not think that rockets come over the border? What is it that you don't think is happening in Israel? What makes you think this isn't a siege?
Rune, go ahead. Go ahead.
You're not succeeding.
Rune, go ahead.
Well, you're talking about. I'm not going to defend terror. Hello. I'm not going to defend terror against civilians. That's not my point at all. As I said, I'm pro-justice. But the argument that you're the victim of terrorism when you're actually occupying power, terrorizing the civilian population every day by settler violence points, water theft of other resources, destruction of crops, all these things that goes on. It's a very violent occupation and always has been. That's one important point. Then you're going to get some reactions, but you can't build up a narrative that you're the victim because of the reactions of the people that you're occupying. That's one thing. The other thing is about the siege. I think it's just not fair to compare the kind of siege that Gaza is subject to right now, for instance, with the kind of siege that Israel. There is no problem getting goods in and out of Israel. And I think Nasser talked about blocking the Suez Canal. He never did it.
Right.
Because Israel went to war.
Right.
Sorry.
Norman.
War. Gaza is under a real siege. And you can't compare the kind of reaction that you're getting from Hamas still. So claiming that Israel is siege is it's not based in facts. And Israel has started every war. We can discuss the initial one in 48, but every war since then has been started by Israel.
Norman, do you want to get in here, Norman?
Well, the notion in my mind, there is no question that both sides, we can find fault with both sides of this conflict. And, we can keep going down that road blaming the one side or the other. And we're at a stage at this point, if we want to find a solution, we should really look and say to ourselves, well, what would the solution be? And how could it be applied? The fact that there's occupation, the settlers on the West Bank that are, in fact, ultra-Orthodox, whatever they are, and why they're there, I'm not even sure. Yes, you can point somebody who I'm friendly with, who settled on that side, on the West Bank. I said to him, tell me why, can you justify settling there? He said, well, go back to 1922, and the League of Nations said that the area between Jordan and the Mediterranean, there was an agreement in the League of Nations that would be Jews. You can go back to Cain and Abel, you can go back to Adam and Eve, but it doesn't help in trying to find a solution to this issue. If we could sit down and say, let's forget about the past for a moment or for an hour or whatever it takes and work out some solution that would work, we could at least try it as a pilot plan in maybe even a segment of the land and see how that works out. But to go down this particular route to keep on blaming the one and the other and so on, yes, we're thinking that, but it's not going to get us to a solution.
Great. So here's what I'm gonna.
That's fine.
Great. David, Norman, and Rune. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna ask one more question. And it's kind of like a put yourself in this person's shoes question. and then there's a speaker in the audience that wants to participate. So after I ask the question, I'm going to allow you guys to address it. This other, audience member, he's going to come in and take my spot because he wants to participate in the conversation, and I'll continue the recording. But I'll just ask that you guys continue to keep the dialogue going, and I'll be in touch with each of you after it's over. Does that sound good with each of you?
Sorry, I missed that part.
For some reason, I have a white screen. Go ahead, Rune.
Rune, what was that? Did you have a question?
Sorry, I missed. I was looking at the chat, so I missed the part. I'm sorry, Max. I have to get used to this multitasking. Are you going to withdraw from the conversation for a while? Is what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm gonna ask one more question for you guys to address and continue talking about. And then there's a person who is watching right now named Stuart that's going to take my place because he wants to join this conversation, and he's actually from South Africa, so he would have a great perspective to bring into this dialogue. Okay, and I'll just ask you guys to continue to keep the conversation civil and valuable. Okay. So my last question. The last question I was just going to bring up for each of you to address is, last weekend we had a Palestinian 25-year-old average normal kid who was on Vonvo, and he talked about how he hasn't been to Jerusalem, which is like 15 miles away from his town, in over 11 years. And he's a totally normal kid, and it was great to have him on. And even today, the person who was supposed to be a part of this conversation, whose name was Omar, he probably isn't participating in this dialogue because, he has an electrical shortage where he lives. He kind of warned me about that before today's conversation, that he might not have internet. So I guess what I just wanted to ask, each of you to address is, do you think it's fair that, people living inside of Israel right now are, able to travel freely throughout the borders and to back and forth between Jerusalem? And, people like Omar, inside the West Bank right now are struggling to, have internet. So maybe you guys can address those talking points, and I'm going to drop out of the conversation. You can keep the convo going, and Stuart will join you in a second, okay?
Okay.
All right, great.
Who do you want to start? Thousands of Arabs come from the West Bank into Israel, into Jerusalem. It's not always easy. It's certainly not a 5-minute drive, but I have worked with Palestinians from the territories, and they say it's quite possible to come in. Some of the teachers when I was studying actually were Palestinians from the territories. It is quite possible to come in. Generally speaking, the checkpoints aren't all that obtrusive, but looking at this in a wider sense, looking at every indicator, the Palestinians are better off than most Arabs all over the Middle East and North Africa, and definitely better off than just about any black African. The idea that this is an incredible suffering simply doesn't bear analysis. 90% of Palestinians are under their own government. Now, if that government are either religious fascists or a corrupt mafia, is hardly Israel's problem. But what is Israel's problem is both the religious mafia, the Islamists and the nationalists both claim that Israel, every inch of Israel is a settlement. Use the term settlement for towns like Tel Aviv. So I'm not overly concerned about whether or not they consider someone over the armistice lines, which is all they are, of 1948, is a settler or not, because they consider all of Israel a settlement, and they consider that there's their duty to destroy all of Israel. Now, if we're talking about solving the problem, let's start. I want to hear from the Palestinians that any agreement will be final. Because right now, I hear from us that they will not accept any agreement whatsoever. And I hear from Fatah when they're talking as the Palestinian Authority, yes, let's talk, but we'll put a list of a page of conditions they know Israel won't accept. And from Fatah, when they're talking about the party, that as soon as Israel is weak, that they will destroy us. What's there to talk about? Let them declare non-belligerence first. Whoever wants to take over from me.
Okay, I'll take it. You're opening too many doors, David. So I'm not sure I can remember to answer all of them. And it's interesting to hear your point of view, because it's not often you get into the mind of a Zionist and how it works. But you talked about Jerusalem and access to Jerusalem first, and of course you're right. Like I was just in Palestine during Ramadan, lots of people stream into Jerusalem during Ramadan. It's also true that it's very for some people to get into Jerusalem, and it's impossible for others. You have people who have been in administrative detention, which is a practice that Israel uses to terrorize basically the Palestinian population. People are randomly picked up, or they were active in some kind of non-violent resistance. They're picked up and jailed. Yes, they are. This is very well documented by all human rights organizations. And if they have been through the system without ever having been charged or sentenced, they cannot enter Jerusalem, for instance. So there are plenty of conditions where it could be hard for Palestinians to enter into Jerusalem. And around the West Bank, to check a tiresome and humiliating ordeal in which you will learn that you're a second-class citizen just by trying. These are facts.
You're not a second-class citizen. That's the whole point. You are not a citizen of Israel. Why do you have a right to enter Israel? Do you have a right to enter? What country do you have a right to enter? It's not your country. I cannot enter. I cannot enter Jordan without going and having a passport.
Yes, East Jerusalem is not Israel. It's occupied Palestinian territory. It's been verified time and again in every report by the United Nations.
But as Israel considers it is Israeli territory, you have the reality is that you are entering what the country. Sorry, can I say that again? You are entering a country that considers it that Jerusalem is sovereign territory. You are not a citizen. You have no rights to enter. Israel is obeying its own laws. Incidentally, just for a historical record, for the 19 years Jordan occupied that area, no Jew could enter Jerusalem or the West Bank.
Yeah, but it doesn't really matter, because that doesn't give Israel any title to East Jerusalem today. This is something that the entire, even the United States, legally agrees about.
Incidentally, the United States doesn't agree about that. Congress and the Senate both have declared that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. The president refuses to move embassy because he claims there are security reasons, but the United States declared Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. That's history.
Yes. Every judge in the International Court of Justice agreed that legally it was that East Jerusalem was occupied Palestinian territory.
You realize that the International Court of Justice did not, Israel did not put its case to the International Court of Justice. It was a decision made without a single Israeli representative there. And you also realize that the International Court of Justice are all appointed by their countries of origin. Now, do you think any of them are going to vote against the policy of the countries they represent? It was a political decision, and I personally think Israel made a bad mistake by not fighting it, even if it would have lost in a kangaroo court. But it didn't fight it. Israel didn't put a case, and the decision was made in absentia.
change that.
It does change the fact.
If I can,
that a territory you took in an offensive war is suddenly your territory. So I mean,
excuse me, I took it in a defensive war. In 1967, Jordan attacked Israel. Jordan could have stayed out of the war, but they were persuaded by Nasser that Israel was losing the war, and so they joined. If Jordan had not attacked Israel, Israel would never have been in the West Bank. It was a defensive war all around.
So this war was initiated by Israel to begin with.
This war was initiated by Egypt when it closed the Straits of Tiran. That was what's called in law Paulus Belli, a legal for war. It was initiated by Egypt and Syria, and in fact, Egypt and Syria have never denied it.
Well, lots of other people have denied it. I don't know.
Can I say something here?
The strait was never efficiently closed. They were talking about closing. It was symbolic action. If that's grounds for going to war and occupying territory, then how can you blame Hamas for sending rockets into Israel when they're much more efficiently, much more brutally sieged than Israel ever was by Egypt?
Hamas is not oppressed by Israel. And I'll rephrase that. You know what? I don't care if Hamas wants to send rockets to Israel. I have no problem hitting back harder and more accurately. If Hamas did not send rockets to Israel, Israel would not attack Hamas, but it does, and Israel defends itself. I have no problem with that. And incidentally, the United Nations declares that to be a right of every country. The right of self-defense is a right of every country.
Guys, we're losing a bit of losing a bit of structure here. You guys are talking over each other.
Okay, sorry.
Please,
I'd like to join at this point.
A siege under siege.
Yeah.
If I had another country, Iraq had another country under siege, making it impossible to have an economy violating its airspace all the time, stealing its territorial water, closing its borders, that would be considered an act of war by any standards. It's an act of war when somebody does that to you, you're under attack. So you make it sound as if it was just two territories situated beside each other. That's not the case here.
I make it sound like Israel is at war. And I've always said from the very beginning of this conversation, Israel has been at war for 63 years. War can take various forms. And I have never denied Israel is at war.
Yeah, it's not a matter of whether Israel is at war, it's whether or not the argument of self-defense is valid here. You have one territory, which is Gaza, that you have under siege, making life impossible there in so many ways, violating.
What is this making life impossible in Gaza?
David, has a. Can you allow people
Stuart,
to talk?
Please, you haven't said anything.
David.
Stuart, please talk.
Yeah, I haven't said anything. No, right. If I can introduce myself, my name. I'm not actually African. I'm British. I was involved in the anti-apartheid for years, and I worked for the ANC in South Africa in the fight against apartheid. So I was in South Africa during those years. To go back to South Africa on a regular basis, I now work for a charity. I've been interested in the Israel-Palestine situation for many years, and I do see many parallels happening in South Africa. And I do think that South Africa and the progress that South Africa has made can lend some insight into how things have resolved also in the Israel-Palestine situation. The reason that I think they're similar is, we get it's apartheid or not, or what form of apartheid it is. But the real similarity of both South Africa and Israel were colonial enterprises. Israel is a colonial country, bizarre and somewhat contradictory. But people can say, on the one hand, because Palestinians have been displaced for 60 years, they have no right to return. Whereas if we believe the Zionist narrative, Jews who've been displaced for 2,000 years have of anyone else. I don't think a state which is defined as a Jewish state can ever be a federal state which has equal rights, because the very definition of a Jewish state is defining the character of a country in a way not consistent, equal rights for everybody. Now, in South Africa and in Israel, you have competing narratives of different peoples, different collective narratives, very different histories are put forward. And whilst I agree with Norman, it's perhaps doesn't help very much to discuss those histories of who attacked who and who was there first and all of those things. There is an importance to that discussion to actually get to what it is, because it's those narratives on the basis of how people understand their history and their national or ethnic identity that they act, that people view the whole situation. And it's very clear that the Israelis and Palestinians have two completely different narratives. I don't think it's fair to say that the Palestinian people are indigenous. All the genetic studies I've seen suggest that people are indigenous genetically. Whether they've changed religion, whether they've had some intermixing of blood with different people who conquered the region, well, countries can say the same as far as that's concerned. But those people were indigenous. They were driven off the land in order to set up a colonial Jewish state, which was mainly people from Europe, who, if they have Jewish roots are 2,000 odd years old. Those didn't come equals in a post British Empire, Palestine or Israel, whatever you want to call it, as equals. They came and wanted, justifiably in a sense, given their immediate history, to set up a state where they could ensure their own supremacy, so that what had happened in Europe could never happen again. Mentality comes from, but I don't think that anyone can that is justice, and that is sensible in terms of basically what's right and wrong. You can't victimise another innocent people for what Europeans did to Jewish people in Europe. And very often it's presented as if there's this historic animosity between Jews, which is a fiction. Many of the Jews that fled Europe were welcomed all throughout the Middle East. Jews were part of the antagonism that exists between Jews and Muslims today really has originated since 1948. Okay, I've said enough for the moment. I'll jump back in. Wants to carry on.
We should come to some agreement that if someone wants to talk, they lift hands or something, because otherwise no one has the signals. Okay. You made a few points, and many of them are simply wrong. Are you aware that 60% of Israel's Jewish population comes from the Middle East and North Africa? This idea that the Jews came from Europe is simply not correct. Some Jews came from Europe. And I wanted to ask you a question, because the same question I asked Ron, and he didn't give me an answer. I'll ask you. If Israel is an apartheid state, I asked you, but I didn't ask Stuart because he wasn't there to be asked. Sorry, well, at least you weren't on the screen to be asked. If Israel is an apartheid state, what other state from the 192 states in the world is an apartheid state? Is Israel the only apartheid state? Is Israel the worst apartheid state? Why is Israel the only state that now gets the label apartheid? Which?
There are many countries that have humanitarian issues and issues of ethnic violence and antagonism between people. peoples and religions, many of which originate from the British Empire. We can talk about those. It's not really relevant. It is the Israel-Palestine issue has gone on for quite a long time. It's certainly a cause of a great suffering and antagonism throughout the whole of the Middle East. I think it's a significant issue that deserves attention on humanitarian grounds and also in terms of international relations. I don't think you can. I think what you're actually attempting to do is to downgrade the problem and to muddy the waters and to basically say, well, look over there. We're not talking about that. We're here to talk about Israel and Palestine.
Well, let me say this. We can dwell on the history ad nauseum. It's going to, if we can bring on the history, we can bring up stuff that, is not relevant and just hurts trying to find a solution. I mean, some people might consider the British Empire and the British to be the instigators of all these problems around the world. They were the foremost colonial power. For them, they were the Dutch, they were the Portuguese. I mean, we can point our fingers and we'll point a finger, we'll find all the other fingers pointing back at us. Then you have the Ottoman Empire. We can go on and on and on, and we're not going to solve anything this way. I think we can all agree on that at least. So if you're born somewhere, and I consider myself indigenous to South Africa. I consider myself indigenous to the earth, to the planet. Now that I've come and now I live in the United States, I'm not indigenous to the United States, but my children were born in the United States. They are indigenous to it. So yes, Stuart, you're right. I mean, if you're born there, you're indigenous to it. Now that we've solved that, it doesn't matter that we originally came from Europe or Africa or from the Garden of Eden. In 1948, there were less than 1.2 million.
Yeah.
And prior to that, there were a lot
Could you
fewer
say
than
that again?
Could you go back a little bit?
Originally back in 1948, if I'm not mistaken, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the total number of Arabs or Palestinians and Jews totaled about 1.2 million. Now we have over 12 million people in this very small piece of land. So, we got a lot of other serious challenges with this kind of population for very few resources as a microcosm of the rest of the world. So to dwell on this history again is ridiculous. The British created these borders, the Jordanian border, the Syrian border. The French had an involvement in it. These are all artificial. The thing to do now is to say 12 million people that we'd like to get their futures in whereby we can see some light at the end of the tunnel. How do we do that? How do we get equality? And South Africa has the same problem. South Africa has a huge inequality problem, probably the highest Gini coefficient in the world in terms of inequality. So a black baby and a white baby, if I can use those terms, and I hate to use those terms, are born very unequal in South Africa today. Notwithstanding that you have a wonderful constitution. If you could take the South African constitution and sit down a group of intelligent Palestinians and intelligent Israelis and get them to sit down and look at that constitution and say, this could work here, and you could have some future. Go on endless talking about who was there first and who should be defending and who should be attacking is an exercise in futility. So I'll let that rest right there while I catch my breath.
But okay, I'd like to respond to that, Norman, because part of the problem in South Africa seems to be exactly that you had constitutional changes, but you didn't have any economic reparations on years of a constitutional inequality. In my opinion, my personal theory, maybe David disagrees with me, but I think that's a Zionist plan that when the West Bank has been doubled up so that you can see now the Palestinians are being driven into small bantustans or reservations. When the reservations are small enough, when they're deprived economically sufficiently to be completely powerless as part of the population, then they'll eventually give in to a one-state solution. And I know there are settlers talking about that right now. And then you have a sort of South African situation. And like you say yourself, a quote-unquote white and a quote-unquote black child is born with very different opportunities. It would be literally hundreds of years before the indigenous South Africans or the Palestinians would be able to fight their way back into society under those circumstances. And that I think personally, if I'm going to be a little bit pessimistic, I think that's what's going to happen.
Well, Rune, I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
But there were still economic lies.
For a I think would be solved within a generation very easily. If in my opinion, that's very possible. But that's South Africa. Israel and Palestine are very different because of many other factors. And to me, the worst possible factor, which is historically in thousands of years, including the Christians, the Crusades, religion is the biggest culprit. And it's not for nothing that at least in as old as the United States Constitution is, it makes a definite statement that religion is separate from the state. The two are very separate. And we don't have that situation in the Middle East. And that, whether you're a Shiite or whether you're a Sunni, Alawaki, or all those different segments are all religious-based, Jewish, etc., etc. And that is the biggest challenge that faces that area. So it's not just, as Stuart says, a question of how do you treat each other equally. One side wants Sharia law, one side wants Talmudic law, and the two are very, very different. And in fact, it doesn't work when you try to get an equal society going. So those are the things that need to be looked at, I believe, and those are the challenges that have to be met. Over to you.
Over to who?
Those challenges have been met quite well in South Africa. I mean, you've got very different people there, and a great deal of inequality still remains, as you correctly state. I mean, that's one of the things I do now, is work at addressing those inequalities by trying to get educated to people who previously didn't. I agree that the history is something that we could debate all and get nowhere. The problem is that it dictates how people view the situation and how people behave. I think a South African style solution could work in Israel, Palestine, or something similar to what's happening in Northern Ireland as well, which is also a very similar situation. Yeah. It has to be based on secular values of all rights. There's no other way to do it. And I think a one-state solution is ultimately the best, because I don't think enough of Palestine to be a viable state, Palestine as a separate state will always be the poor neighbour to Israel, and I don't think that addresses the problem of people returning to where they came from in both sides. Jews who want to return to where they came from elsewhere in the Middle East. They might want to go or where it was, Morocco, wherever it was that they came from, where they were perhaps dispossessed as well. So I think you need to have, some principles that guide the solution, and that has to be equal rights, and that has to be justice. And that begins, I think, by acknowledging the suffering that people have endured and the wrongs of the past. When people have been dispossessed, it's no good to still carry on denying that they even existed as a people, as I've heard many Zionists do, and say Palestinians don't exist. There was no Palestinian country, there are no Palestinians Arabs. That really doesn't help. These are people that are from there, that have suffered injustice, and that needs to be addressed. And to understand as well that much of the hostility that exists is directed at people because they're Jew, it's directed at people because they're occupied.
Stuart, it's really hard. Stuart, it's really hard to hear you. Please, Stuart, it's really hard to hear you. I'm missing half of what you're saying. Also with Norman, perhaps we could agree to keep our statements fairly short, because that way we can at least address them. If we make long conversations, I only hear half of it. Is there anyone else getting better? Because I see people making this to the ears that you're not hearing either. Could you make 1 or 2 points and we'll address them?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I'm struggling to hear some of you, but go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to take 1 point
at a time. Okay, Norman, make a point and then we'll discuss it, please. You lead.
All right. Let's put aside. We can have this discussion about South Africa, in the right context. The point that I'm making is we should look in a conversation like this to simply look ahead. What is it that we should do at this point? What is the right point for the two sides to come together? And it may take a year of negotiation. Maybe it's not negotiation. Maybe it's a year or two of discussion. Selected group of people and their staffs, and iron out what would work best for sides together. What I'd like to see, unfortunately, there's some elements, namely Hamas and Hezbollah, that wouldn't participate. So that would have to also be addressed within that negotiation situation, discussion situation. How do we address those two elements? But all those things are on the table for discussion, and that's the only way to go.
Stop. You've said enough. Please, could Ruan or Stuart address that? Because if you go on, we're not going to be able to. Ruan, I know that there's no adjudicator or referee, so I'll just simply go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it's fair to everyone. Ruan, could you please address what Norman said?
One thing that in the factual department, Hamas has repeatedly said it would, for instance, that it would be willing to solve the conflict within the 1967 line, and it's been repeated even after Operation Pillar of Cloud. So you have to sort of solve the dichotomy between what the media say that Hamas is saying and what they're actually saying. And the other thing is a negotiation scenario where you have to find the right framework for negotiation, because when you have a negotiation between the all powerful and the powerless, you're going to get negotiations that will fail. So you have to find a new framework for negotiations. And you have to start by acknowledging that Hamas. I don't particularly like Hamas, but they're the legitimate government of Gaza, and they're a negotiation partner, and they're willing to be that. They put that in writing even.
Stuart?
Yeah,
But,
I mean, I would.
Yeah, negotiation. He looked. Oh, sorry, that's my last point. He looked over his shoulder and he said, "I'm not going to give them anything," and that's how he went into negotiation. So the outcome was pretty predictable. Thank you.
I think it's best if we go left to right. Stuart?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, as far as I'm aware, Hamas were at negotiations that were taking place at the Americans' broke. I thought that was a huge mistake. You know, if you're going to negotiations, or if you're going to even have questions about negotiations, they have to be unconditional and they have to include all of the parties. So I think Israel can't, before negotiating, talking to anyone, that they recognise Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, because that is keeping the whole argument before the negotiations. Northern Ireland, the British government secretly the IRA. In South Africa, the same thing happened. Place with various South African business, the ANC. That included government representatives. I know some of the people who were involved in that process. You have to have unconditional, fully open discussions which include all of the parties, and they need to be brokered by an impartial observer. And that, I don't believe, can be the United States, because the United States is not impartial in the situation. I don't know who else it should be, but I think the US has proved itself to be not a fair mediator of these discussions. It's the party itself. Maybe a party in the talks, but not as a mediator.
Okay. I cannot believe that you know so little about Hamas that you believe Hamas is willing to negotiate. Khaled Mashal was talking about destroying Israel. Incidentally, he was also talking about destroying Ramallah just last week. The thing to realize is that the reason Hamas opposes Israel is because Israel is a blasphemy. It's a double blasphemy. It's a blasphemy, and this is what is in writing. Hamas has never put in writing that they were willing to negotiate with Israel. In fact, what Hamas has put in writing is that they're not willing. That no negotiations are acceptable. Why is Israel a blasphemy? Two reasons. And we have to deal with this because this is the real world. Not some world where four people sit in a room and say, well, let's all get together. This is the people we deal with. Hamas says that any land that was once under Islamic control remains Islamic forever. Now, if that doesn't scare you, it should, because that includes Bulgaria, Spain, Cyprus. And Hamas says that the Jews must be second-class citizens, called dhimmi. Now, they even say in their own documents twice that their role is to kill the Jews. Now, anyone can quote from the Bible or the Quran or whatever, but it's very important what you choose to quote. And the passage that Hamas chooses to quote is the bit that says that even the trees and the rocks will call to the Muslims, there's a Jew hiding behind me, let's kill him. Now, do they believe it? Yes, most definitely. What propels Hamas is exactly that is Islamic imperative. So the idea that we should include them in the negotiations about what? Where to commit suicide? I don't understand where you think that Hamas wants to be a negotiating partner. Hamas does not want to be a negotiating partner. All Hamas has said that it will let the Palestinian Authority negotiate. It never has said that it will accept any negotiation. And it's very, very important because here's a question for all of you. If you get what you want, the Islamists take over and begin slaughtering not only the Jews, not only the Christians, but any Arab who doesn't want to live in a Sharia, sorry, I'm losing my voice, you can probably hear that, a Sharia Iranian state, what are you going to do? Isn't it too late then? Because Hamas openly says that is their aim. You're asking Israel to take steps which rationally are suicidal. What are you going to do if it turns out I'm right? Say, oops, I'm sorry, and I'm afraid I'm going to come out as a spectator. I've completely lost my voice. I may come in later. Thank you.
Okay, can I just answer that really quickly? And that David must answer in writing, because I have Hamas President Obama actually in front of me, and it says the following. It's it says we in the Hamas we in the Hamas government contributing solution to the conflict, not a contradiction with the international community and life exist an international court of justice, United Nations General Assembly, and lead human rights organizations. We have to engage all parties on mutual respect and without the conditions. That's in writing to President Obama.
I think David may have turned his speaker. We're getting an awful lot of feedback. David, if you can hear, David here, could you turn off your microphone, perhaps? We're getting a lot of echo, a lot of feedback. Perhaps I'm not using headphones. Perhaps it's Norman.
Is it me?
If those using open mics could turn their mics off when they're not speaking, that might help the feedback. I couldn't hear anything of what you said then, really. Very sorry. Yeah, it's still there. Okay. It's impossible to tell who it is. Generally, headphones work better because you don't get the feedback from the headphone, from the sound back to the mic.